She didn't wear the uniform to prove anything, just black PT shorts, an old army shirt, and a duffel slung over one shoulder. But the admin officer took one look and said, "You can't wear that, not unless you're active duty," ordering her to change or leave the base. And when she turned to go, the back of her shirt lifted just enough for someone across the room to see the tattoo on her upper back. And then they froze, because that ink didn't come from a beach parlor or a flair for symbols. It came from a mission that never made the news, but changed the life of someone still in command. Want to know what the tattoo meant and why everything changed after that? Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. The New Mexico sun had barely crested the horizon when Dana Carver pulled her weathered Tacoma through the gates of Fort Ridgeline. The air tasted of dust and diesel fumes, that familiar cocktail every soldier knows by heart. Heat waves already shimmered off the asphalt, and the distant hum of generators mixed with the morning chatter of boots on concrete. A convoy of supply trucks rumbled past the guardhouse, their engines adding to the symphony of military efficiency that never really slept. She cut the engine and sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel. The parking lot stretched ahead of her, half empty, except for a cluster of government vehicles near the admin building. Through her windshield, she could see the track field where young recruits were already gathering, their voices carrying on the dry wind like echoes of her own past. Some were stretching, others checking their laces with the nervous energy of soldiers about to be tested. Dana checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. 46 years old, gray threading through brown hair pulled back tight, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when she'd first earned those 3 numbers on her back. But her posture was still straight, her hands still steady. Dan stepped out slowly, methodically. Her movements had that deliberate quality that comes from years of making every motion count. She wore a faded Army PT uniform, gray shirt soft from countless washes, black shorts that had seen better days. The fabric held the ghost of old creases pressed sharp in another life when appearances mattered to promotion boards and inspection teams. The nameplate was gone, leaving only faint impressions in the fabric where Carver had once been stitched in black thread. Her dog tags barely glinted beneath the collar, hanging on a chain she'd never taken off, not once in 23 years, to anyone watching. She looked like just another retiree, trying to hold on to something that used to define her. Maybe someone who missed the structure, the purpose, the simple clarity of knowing your mission and executing it without question. But Dana wasn't here to make a statement. She was here because Sergeant Major Dean had called 3 weeks ago, his voice rough with age and too many desert deployments, asking if she'd pace the female recruits during their annual evaluation. "Need someone who knows what it means to push through when everything's falling apart," he'd said, his words carrying weight beyond their surface meaning. Someone who's been there. Dana had said yes before he'd finished asking, not because she missed the Army, though some days she did with an ache that settled deep in her chest, but because she remembered being 19 and scared, running beside women who'd already proven themselves, learning what strength looked like when it wasn't performed for an audience. She checked her gear one final time: water bottle, car keys, the folded authorization papers that should have made this simple. In her duffel, wrapped carefully in an old t-shirt, was something else. A photograph from 2000. 5 soldiers grinning at the camera. Outside, a forward operating base that no longer existed. 4 of those faces would never age past that moment. The base admin building loomed ahead, all concrete and bureaucracy. Dana pushed through the heavy glass doors into a wall of refrigerated air that made her skin prickle after the desert heat. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over beige walls covered in safety posters and outdated announcements. A faded banner proclaimed excellence in all we do above a bulletin board cluttered with duty rosters and training schedules. The floor was that industrial linoleum that every government building seemed to share, polished to a dull shine by decades of boots. Behind the front counter, a young specialist named Morrison looked up from his computer screen, his expression shifting from boredom to mild confusion. He had the soft look of someone who'd never seen combat, never felt that particular weight that settled on your shoulders after you'd been shot at and returned fire. The nameplate on his desk read SPC Morrison J in crisp block letters. "Morning, ma'am. Can I help you?" Donna Sainva approached the counter with quiet confidence, her boots making soft sounds on the polished floor. She pulled folded papers from her jacket pocket, each crease precise and deliberate. "Dana Carver, I'm here for the training support. Should be on your volunteer roster." Morrison took the papers, scanning them with the kind of half-attention that spoke of too many routine requests. Behind him, 2 civilian staffers were sorting files, their conversation a low murmur punctuated by occasional laughter. Coffee percolated in a corner machine, filling the air with that burnt smell of government brew that had been sitting too long on the burner. Morrison frowned at the screen. "I'm showing a D Carver on the list, but..." He looked up at her PT uniform, then back at the papers. "Ma'am, I don't think that uniform is authorized unless you're currently assigned to the base." One of the staffers, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, glanced over. "Policy's pretty clear on that," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Can't have people wandering around in uniform pieces just because they used to serve." Her colleague nodded. "You'd think folks would know better. Playing dress-up doesn't make you active duty again." Dana's expression didn't change. She stood there, patient as stone, while Morrison clicked through more screens. The smell of burnt coffee drifted from a corner machine, mixing with the antiseptic scent of government-issue floor cleaner. "I'll need to check with the supervisor," Morrison finally said, disappearing into a side office. Minutes ticked by. Through the windows, Dana could see the recruits beginning their warm-up stretches, their young bodies moving with the eager awkwardness of soldiers still learning their own strength. A few glanced toward the admin building, curiosity flickering across their faces. When Morrison returned, he brought company. Lieutenant Kalin strode out of the office like he was already solving a problem that hadn't been properly explained to him. Early 30s, pressed uniform, the kind of confidence that hadn't been tested by anything harder than training scenarios. His boots were polished to mirror perfection, his uniform creases sharp enough to cut paper. He carried himself with the authority of rank, but lacked the worn edges that came from using it under fire. "Miss Carver," he extended a hand with practiced courtesy, the kind they taught in officer candidate school. "I understand there's some confusion about your participation today." Dana shook his hand once firmly. Her grip was calloused, strong in a way that surprised him. "Sergeant First Class Dana Carver, retired. I'm cleared to support the evaluation." Kellen glanced at the paperwork she'd submitted, his eyes scanning the lines with the methodical precision of someone who trusted regulations more than instinct. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the lieutenant bars on his collar, casting small shadows across his name tape. "This is more of a recommendation than an actual order," he said, his tone taking on that particular quality officers used when they wanted to sound reasonable while being inflexible. "And Regulation AR 6701 is pretty specific about uniform wear. The PT uniform is for active duty personnel conducting official duties." He gestured to Morrison, who held up a folded base t-shirt in a plastic bag. "Generic, civilian safe." The shirt was navy blue with Fort Ridgeline printed in block letters across the chest. "We'd be happy to have you out there in appropriate attire," Callan continued, his smile never wavering. "Otherwise, I'm afraid base policy requires..." He let the sentence hang, his tone still polite, but with steel underneath. Donna looked at the offered shirt, then back at Callan. She didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't defend her right to be there. The silence stretched for several heartbeats, filled only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of recruits calling cadence outside. She simply nodded, bent to retrieve her duffel bag from where she'd set it beside the counter, and turned toward the door. That's when it happened. As she leaned forward, her PT shirt rode up slightly, exposing the skin between her shoulder blades. The fabric pulled tight across her back, revealing what lay beneath. There, etched in stark black ink against sun-weathered skin, were 3 numbers that made the air in the room suddenly feel thinner. 1375. The tattoo wasn't decorative. It wasn't memorial art or some motivational phrase and flowing script. It was just numbers, angular and precise, burned into skin like a brand. The ink had faded slightly over the years, but the lines remained sharp, uncompromising. Below the numbers, barely visible, was a smaller symbol, a stylized owl with its wings spread perched above crossed swords. Morrison didn't notice. He was already turning back to his computer. The morning's excitement over, Ken was adjusting his uniform, satisfied that policy had been maintained. But Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, walking past the hallway with a maintenance clipboard tucked under his arm, stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes locked onto those numbers, and his face went pale. The clipboard slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering on the linoleum floor. Rodriguez had seen that tattoo before in classified briefings he wasn't supposed to remember on, after-action reports that technically didn't exist. He'd been a young corporal then, assigned to intelligence analysis, tasked with reading between heavily redacted lines. Most of the reports had been boring, routine, but some had kept him awake at night. Detachment 1375, Night Owl Group, the unit that held the Northern Gate fallback route when everything went to hell. The unit that saved a NATO convoy by fighting alone for 43 minutes against impossible odds. The unit that was disbanded and erased from official records because what they'd done was too classified to acknowledge, too sensitive to celebrate, too dangerous to remember officially. Rodriguez watched Dana walk toward the exit, her movements still calm, still measured. His throat felt dry. He should say something, should tell them who she really was. Instead, he turned and walked quickly toward the back offices, his clipboard forgotten, his mind racing toward a phone call he probably shouldn't make, but absolutely had to. Outside, Dana found a spot on the bleachers near the track. She set down her duffel and watched the recruits go through their paces. The sun climbed higher, painting everything in shades of brass and shadow. The young soldiers moved with energy and purpose, their voices carrying on the desert wind. She didn't sulk, didn't fume, just sat there, patient as the desert itself, watching the next generation prepare for challenges they couldn't yet imagine. A breeze caught her shirt, lifting it slightly. The tattoo remained visible, 3 numbers that told a story most people would never know. But Donna had learned long ago that recognition wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned one quiet moment at a time. In the admin building, Rodriguez had found an empty office marked "Communications Authorized Personnel Only" and locked the door behind him. His hands shook slightly as he dialed a number he'd memorized but never used, a number from a briefing packet that had been burned after reading. The office smelled of stale coffee and old paper, with a single window that looked out over the motor pool where mechanics were already working under the climbing sun. It rang twice before a crisp voice answered. No identification, no greeting. Command liaison. Rodriguez swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. Sir, this is Staff Sergeant Rodriguez at Fort Ridgeline. I need to report situation involving a possible classified personnel identification. A pause that stretched longer than heartbeats. In the background, Rodriguez could hear the faint sound of keyboards clicking, the distant murmur of serious voices handling serious business. Go ahead, Sergeant. This line is secure. We have a volunteer here, retired female. She's got ink that... Rodriguez swallowed hard, thinking of the briefings, the redacted files, the whispered stories. Sir, she's got Detachment 1375 marked on her, clear as day with the owl insignia. The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Rodriguez could almost hear gears turning, databases being accessed, decisions being weighed at levels far above his pay grade. Are you certain of the identification, Sergeant? Yes, sir. Dead certain. I've seen those marks in classified materials. This isn't some wannabe with internet research. Understood. What's her current status with base personnel? They just asked her to leave. Uniform violation. Some lieutenant thinks she's playing dress up. Another pause. Longer this time. Rodriguez heard papers shuffling, urgent whispers in the background. Sergeant Rodriguez, you will immediately inform your commanding officer that this individual is to be treated with full courtesy and given any assistance she requires. This comes from levels you don't need to know about. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Absolutely. And Rodriguez, sir, this conversation never happened, but if anyone disrespects that woman again, they'll answer to people who don't wear name tapes. The line went dead with a finality that made Rodriguez's hands shake as he replaced the receiver. 10 minutes later, Major Ronson emerged from the admin building like a man on a mission. He was Fort Ridgeline's training officer, a man who'd seen enough combat to know the difference between paperwork warriors and the real thing. His uniform was crisp, but his boots were scuffed, and he carried himself with the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. He found Lieutenant Callan still at the front desk, sorting through volunteer paperwork with the satisfied air of a problem solver. Lieutenant, Ronson's voice cut through the ambient chatter. I understand we've had an issue with the volunteer authorization. Kellen straightened. Yes, sir. Uniform regulation compliance. I handled it appropriately. Ronson placed a printed document on the counter. The header read, Service Verification, Sergeant First Class Dana Carver. Special clearance for training support activities valid through end of quarter. This was in your inbox since Tuesday, Ronson said quietly. Why wasn't it processed? Kellen's face went through several shades of pale. Sir, there's a lot of paperwork. You must have failed to do your job properly." Ronson's voice remained level, but there was permafrost underneath, which means you questioned the authorization of a decorated veteran because you couldn't be bothered to read your email. Through the window, they could see Dana still sitting on the bleachers, her posture unchanged, her attention focused on the recruits. Ronson folded the document and tucked it into his pocket. "I'm going to fix this. And Lieutenant," "Yes, sir. Next time you think about playing uniform police with someone you don't know, maybe ask yourself if you're qualified to make that judgment call." Ronson headed for the door, leaving Kaylin standing there with the slow, sick realization that he just made the kind of mistake that follows you through your entire career. Dana saw him coming before he reached the bleachers. Colonel Ford moved like water, smooth and inevitable. He was Fort Ridgeline's commanding officer, a man whose reputation preceded him into every room he entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through close-cropped hair and the kind of bearing that spoke of decisions made under fire. His uniform was crisp, but lived in, with ribbons that told stories of deployments to places that didn't make the news. When he stopped 6 feet from where she sat, his hands clasped behind his back, Dana didn't stand, just looked up with those same steady eyes that had stared down enemy fire, that had watched good soldiers take their last breaths, that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. The recruits on the track had noticed the colonel's approach, their conversations quieted, heads turning to watch this unexpected encounter. Even at a distance, they could sense something significant was about to happen. She walked to her truck, the same weathered Tacoma that had carried her through civilian life, now somehow different than it had been that morning. As she climbed in and started the engine, the recruits who'd run behind her were gathered near the barracks, still talking about the woman who'd made their best pace look effortless. Dana pulled away down the gravel road that wound behind the base, past the motor pool and the training fields, and the endless expanse of desert beyond. In her rear-view mirror, Fort Ridgeline grew smaller, but somehow more solid, like something important had been settled there. Nobody stopped her. Nobody questioned her right to be there. And the next time someone mentioned Detachment 1375, it wouldn't be in whispered rumors or classified files. It would be in the respectful silence of people who finally understood what real service looked like. They ordered her to remove the uniform until the base commander spotted the tattoo on her back.